Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to this session. And today we are going to talk about a very exciting and very relevant topic. That is, how can we actually capitalize as clinics, as healthcare providers, this huge amount of data that we are sitting on. And not only in terms of clinical trials, which is of course a long established practice, but also into other new revenue streams. And the questions that I would like to answer today is, who is interested in the data that clinics have around the globe? What is this data worth and how could we price this? And what are models to collaborate with the companies that are interested in these types of data? So very shortly on my side, I'm Philipp Grestscher. I work as a principal at Syte Institute, and we are a specialized company focusing on implementing digital health and AI solutions together with insurances, pharma, medtech, and clinics all around the globe. And we have a very strong focus on delivering solutions that provide measurable medical and economic outcomes. And for these outcome improvements, of course, clinical data, but especially also real-world data are paramount in order to be able to measure this. And this is why we are a lot in contact with the topic of real-world data from an industry point of view. So from the pharma, medtech, insurance side, but also with the healthcare providers. And I would like to make use of that bridge that we are building in order to share some insights also for you, what our experiences are here, and what the opportunities for clinics are, as well as to see, okay, what are the challenges and how can these challenges be overcome. If you would like to continue the conversation about this, feel free to send me a LinkedIn invitation or directly via WhatsApp or an email at any time. So let's jump in. The point is that, as many of you of course know, hospitals are actually producing a massive amount of healthcare data. Actually, there are some estimations that each hospital is basically generating 50 petabytes of data per year. And this data is actually growing with a very expensive rate of 36%. So there's more and more data coming in. And what I find so interesting personally and so exciting, which is also unique to healthcare when we talk about these types of really big data, is that the data is so diverse. So we have, of course, the EHR data with the patient histories, diagnosis, prescriptions, but also genomic data, right? We have imaging data, lab, and then even wearable data that's coming in around the patient, plus the administrative and claims data. And this provides a very unique opportunity to build holistic pictures around the patients. However, of course, it's also challenging because these various types of data need to be made ready to be processed, and also, of course, they need to be put into the right context with each other. And despite this huge potential, having so much data, it's really a pity that at the moment 97% of this data is remaining unused outside of the clinics. So actually at the moment only 3% of the data that is there is being used with industry for other real-world data, product development, etc. And something that's really surprising why this is so low is because actually there are a lot of companies that are very hungry for this data, for this real-world patient data to develop their products. And those are the pharma companies, of course. It's medtech companies, insurance companies, but also technology companies, so health tech companies that are developing new gadgets, and even data intermediaries. So there are a lot of potential customers for these data that have different interests on how to use this. We'll jump into this in a bit. And additionally, and that's really the opportunity also for the clinics, these companies are really struggling to get this data because on the one hand, of course, sometimes regulatory-wise it's challenging, but majorly they really lack the tools to reach the patients after the treatment. So maybe something that you've also, if there are also some people from pharma here, they've heard it definitely before. It's this topic going beyond the pill or beyond the device. So basically saying, okay, we don't just want to deliver a device or medication, then we're out, but we really also want to see, okay, what is the patient doing with it? Having digital applications, for example, to track its adherence, doing remote monitoring to see are there any adverse events happening. But this is something that industry is still struggling with, and this is problematic for them because that's where they could get this real-world patient data. And actually, more than half of the industry leaders in life science say that this complete and infragmented data that they have is a major challenge, and actually they have a lot of difficulty finding this hard to access data that I just mentioned. And this, in my view, provides a huge opportunity for clinics to actually do something with the data that they have. So the question is a bit, okay, what do they actually want to have this data for? To give a little bit of an overview, what are the key use cases? The pharma companies, of course, they're always very interested in identifying new drug targets and especially enhancing or extending indications of existing ones. So the so-called label expansions are something where there's special interest for this real-world data in order to get one medication from its initial to a new indication. Like the GLP-1s that are very famous at the moment, originally developed for diabetes, are now also being used for treating obesity. However, it's not only about placing medicines, but also to understand the patient better. Are there any needs of the patient that they don't even know about because they don't have any data on the patient when he's in the treatment journey? So this is something that's very important for the pharmaceutical companies, and along with that, of course, also to enhance clinical trials. The same counts for medtech companies, and they are also very keen to understand, for example, usage preferences of their products. And that's not only for the products that the patients are using, but of course also the products that are being used in the clinic, right? I mean, there's also a lot of device data next to the patient data being generated, and that's also something that's very interesting for them. Last but not least, of course, we have the insurance companies, and they always like to say, okay, are there any risks in our populations? Are there opportunities where we can proactively steer the care so that we have better cost effectiveness? Of course, insurances want to balance always the medical outcomes with the costs and have better population-based prevention and monitoring. This is something they also like to use this real-world data for. So in order to do this, these companies, of course, have to turn to data vendors. And when we take a look at where do they get the data from, actually, they turn just where the patient data is produced. 47% of the clinics, or of the industry, that are using real-world data are using outpatient healthcare facility data, right? So this is something where they have a lot of data on it, where they generate a lot of data, but also the inpatient healthcare facilities with 25% are actually a major source of the data. And what you can see here is that these are even more important to them than, for example, mobile apps, and that I also just mentioned, right, in the section of digital care. So they turn to different sites to get different types of data. And that's very important because it provides also an opportunity not only for super large companies, but for super large companies or also super large healthcare providers, but also for smaller institutions that might have some interesting special data. And actually, this is also reflected in the numbers because what we see is that the companies that are interested in this real-world data of clinics don't only use one data vendor. They actually have what we call a multi-vendor strategy. So they build their portfolio of data vendors that help them to fulfill the use cases. Basically meaning there's not only one person that gets the whole cake, but there are a lot of slices, a lot of pieces of the cake, and a lot of people can get something from this. So if you think this is interesting, happy to share more information on this. I personally think it's very exciting because actually there are clinics already doing this at the moment. One example is Mayo Clinic, that probably a lot of you know. They have developed a platform that's called Discover, so Platform Discover. And what they have here is they offer access to over 14 million patient records. Of course, it's a very big provider, right? So, I mean, this is one of the basically top tier examples, but I think it's an important example to show because this can also serve as a blueprint for learning. And this is very much commercialized. So they basically have this platform where industry can use this de-identified data that cannot be exported but can be used on their platform for several things like AI model training, of course, very important for health tech companies, but also for the pharma companies, for the med tech companies, and other use cases. And the commercial model that they have employed here is a subscription. So basically the Spotify principle that you say, okay, you pay a certain fee every month and then you have access to this platform and you can use the data. And that provides them with a recurring revenue that's coming from all of the data that they generate. Of course, this requires a certain level of investment before because this data has to be made ready for use. Right? So here we basically have the picture book example, that you have a whole platform where companies can use the data in the cloud. There are also other examples that can solve this a bit more pragmatically. One other interesting example here from Europe, for example, is the Assistance Publique Hôpitaux de Paris. It's a Paris hospital, one of the largest hospital networks in the region. And they also have basically a clinical data warehouse with all the data where they have de-identified data sets that the companies, so industry partners, but also researchers can use. And again, they have a commercialized model for this. So it does not only work in the USA, but it also works in Europe, where, of course, as you all know, we have very high data regulations. And those are two very famous examples, but there are actually a lot of others. From the NHS to Truveta, the Karolinska Institute from Sweden, and even in Germany, basically the world's capital of data protection. There are very successful examples on how hospitals are doing this. So it is possible to build up these revenue streams. And something that often is, of course, asked in at the beginning, hey, Philipp, what is my data actually worth? Like, I want to build a business case out of this. So can you tell me what will I get for the data? Because obviously this will then define how much do we invest, right? What's the return on investment? And the answer depends a bit, of course, on the case, but there are data how can approximate it at least. What you see here are price ranges from a survey that has been conducted across different types of data sets. And of course, you have the EHR data that's priced with a median of around 60 euros per patient data set. And the most expensive ones are the genomics data. Because especially in pharma, they're very interesting, but also specialist data, oncology data has actually quite a high value. And we can use these ranges at least for an initial investment, for an initial investment assessment. Of course, it does not only depend on the type of data that we have. It also depends on how the data properties are. So basically saying, do we just have raw data in an Excel file, or is it clean data, or is it even cross-linked? So meaning, do we have, with the whole bunch of data that we have around patients, do we have these data cross-linked? Can we make relationships out of this? And the more we have here, the higher the value ultimately gets. That does not mean that we can only start once we have the patient outcome linked on the very right side. We can also start earlier, but it will define the business case a little bit. And what we see is actually that pharmaceutical companies show a very strong demand and a willingness to pay for this real-world patient data, especially in oncology. However, what we also see is that they have non-standard pricing structures. So it's really up to the case, and that's something that we then also often say, okay, what's really the suitable licensing model behind it? Because there's not one business model that works for all. It really needs to be done by the case. And it also depends a bit on who is buying the data. There are some price differences between the pharma, the medtechs, and also insurances in terms of the willingness to pay. But again, here we have some initial data that help us to build at least ranges and then further validate. One very interesting topic is, of course, also genomic data. In the area of genomic data, actually, it's one of the most valuable data sources, especially for pharmaceutical companies. And we have, of course, two types of data to estimate these prices because they're not public. We have, on the one hand, these surveys that we just saw, and the other is something that we also do regularly. These are just some examples, is based on recent transactions to estimate, okay, how much money was spent on average per a certain data set. And these can range in the area of genomics. When we take a look at some of the large pharmaceutical companies that acquired genomic data from $6 per patient data set up to 950. Some reports even state with 1,500 is something that we had not found yet. But based on the transaction data, that's something that we see a lot. However, of course, despite all of this opportunity, there's a certain challenge involved, right? Because you need to do some things in advance in order to be able to make this data work. So the major things that need to be done is what we call the productization of data. So we need curated data sets, we need a service and support layer, and some platform infrastructure. Then the second question is, of course, the data licensing and the monetization models. So how can we, for example, license the data? So do we do subscription, or do we do a project-based access? Do we do revenue sharing or co-development with shared intellectual property? The same counts for the contractual framework, right? It's very important that we have a clear scope, duration, and also data set boundaries. Last but not least, again, for the pricing, here we need to define what's the setup fee, what's the ongoing fee, etc. And then we have some technological enablers like standardization, interoperability, secure analysis, and cloud and AI partnerships. And this is, of course, not super easy, but there are ways to navigate this. And what we like to do here really is very pragmatically at the beginning, start before we invest in this infrastructure, say, hey, let's do a pragmatic assessment. In module 1, we do an assessment of the potential revenue range and what data volumes might be required. And with this, you can always say, okay, does it make sense to move forward or no? Once we have this, then we normally do a very pragmatic assessment with potential clients. We talk to some people, say, okay, what would this data be worth for you in the form that it is? And already based on that, we get the fact basis we need in order to say, okay, does it make sense to move forward now? And what investment would be needed? And this is something that can be done within 2 weeks, sometimes also takes 8 weeks, but it's a very short time frame and that we can do this. And it helps to really put some first facts on the business case when there's a lot of uncertainty, and also helps to maximize the ROI with an initial, very low initial cost. And this is, for example, what we do a lot with the companies that we have. And we also have some pricing calculators that we then use in this first phase. So since we are moving now to the end of the webinar, just a short snapshot of the companies that we are working with. And the point really is we are really covering the whole healthcare system, and that really helps to build these bridges between institutions. And this is also something the clinics that we are working with for this real-world data collaborations value that, especially, of course, we can bridge into the industry, but we also understand the clinical processes. We have a lot of physicians in our team, and yeah, that's basically what we do. If you found this interesting, happy to connect later and dive deeper into it.
Thank you, Philipp. I think you show us a new vision of the market, of the opportunities of the sell and interpret this data. But I have a very important question, and I think the European people is thinking about it too. Um, Thinking about the GDPR, how can we make adjustments to ensure the compliance, and how far can we go with the translations of the data without without fight with the GDPR, or in Brazil the LGPD?
Yeah. So what's of course important is that we have de-identified patient data. And then the question is, of course, where does the data analysis take place? And here, a very interesting methodology, especially when we talk about AI training, is what we call federated machine learning. So basically that AI algorithms do not actually access the real data, but they access another algorithm that has been trained on local data. So there's no need for data export, but only the information of the data, simply speaking, is being exported, and that helps us to be GDPR conform.
Thank you. And one more question about the scenario in Europe, especially. How you are collecting this data today in Europe?
So we are collecting these data in multiple forms. So this is something that we do then in the collaboration planning. It can either be that one single larger university hospital, for example, is collecting the data on their own proprietary platforms, or there are also conglomerates of clinics fusing together to build a kind of separate data infrastructure where they put their data together. We then make it basically machine ready. And that also helps them to give some volume and scale into the data.
So the synergy between the clinics and hospital data, it's real. It exists in Europe.
It does, definitely. There are a lot of projects also in the European Union level, accelerated by the European health data space. Maybe that's something that some people have heard of already. It's basically really on the European level, making clinical data available. And there are a lot of sub-projects running on this with exactly the principles that I just outlined in terms of data conform, federated analysis, and really bringing in this volume that we need in order to make real-world impact with this data.
In Brazil, we are doing short steps to get the interoperability better, and get this synergy between the data from hospital to clinics and from laboratory to clinics. So, what is your recommendation for us, for our scenario? That is the beginner scenario. We are doing the first steps. How do you recommend we do this journey to the interoperability and the synergy between the data?
Mm-hmm. So of course, that always depends very much on the individual status quo. So my recommendation is to start very pragmatically before focusing, okay, what do we have and what do we not have in terms of infrastructure? Take a look at the data that is there, do a very pragmatic assessment of the potential value, and then start talking to potential clients. And once you have this in place, then let's think about, for example, do we have already some existing infrastructure where we can offer this in a bilateral relationship? Or do we need to do further investments into the interoperability? But I think it shouldn't be a bottleneck to start thinking about this, because there are solutions, especially once the business case and the return on investment is clear. It makes it much easier to then secure budgets also for these types of projects with the decision makers.
Perfect. And here in the future hospital, we are talking about exclusively of hospitals now, the big hospitals and small hospital scenarios. And in Brazil, we have a big difference between the size of these hospitals and the structure and the access. So when you talk about small hospitals, is this possible? We can make the translations with this data and capture this data, and this data have value for the small hospitals?
Yes, 100%, it's a possibility. Here, it's really important to take a look at the data. As I said, there are some high-value data sets, especially when we talk about, for example, specialized clinics that just have low volumes but one certain indication where they do complex procedures. That is data that is hard to access. It's a niche data, and if this has high quality, even low volumes in a specific niche can have high impact for the industry players and thus be highly valuable.
Okay, so we think we have a nice scenario now, and now we know when to start and when we have to get. We have a big example, and you show us a very important vision. I think we didn't have before the vision of the value of this data and how it's possible to make this translation and how we can get this data, and most of these more than this, which kind of data we can get to make these translations. So if no one else have any questions, I think we didn't get any other questions. I will let you do your final speech, and then we'll talk about the collect how we collect this data in the next talk. So it's your show. Make your final speech, and I will be here for the next talk.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. Looking forward to connect on this topic and to see how we can pragmatically, with low initial investments, get a fact basis on the value of your data and how to capitalize it with industry partners. Thank you.